Um, Hello, everyone. Shalom Aleichem. Seid begrüßt. Ich heiße Miri Coral. My name is Miri Coral. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Toronto UJA Committee for Yiddish, as well as the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language. Usually, our speaker today, Vivian Felsen, and I are kind of the introducers for someone else. But today we have the rare pleasure of hearing Vivian herself talk about a fascinating topic. And who is Vivian? If you don't know, Vivian is an award-winning translator of both French and Yiddish into English. And she began her career as a Yiddish translator with the books by her maternal grandfather, who was a Montreal journalist by the name of Israel Medres. And these books are Montreal of Yesterday, which was published in 2000, and Between the Wars, published in 2003. And since then, her published translations from Yiddish include short stories and Holocaust memoirs. And her most recent translations are included in what we're going to hear about today, On the Waves of Destiny, published by the University of Toronto Press, and Moshe Broderzon's Idle Chatter. And so not only is Vivian a wonderful translator, but she's also, for all these many years, been my co-conspirator in bringing to you some, I think, amazing, diverse programs about Yiddish culture. And so I am so delighted to have a chance to hear about the work that she's been so passionate about in recent times. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Vivian Felsen.
Thank you, Miri. I just wanted to say that for several years now, the Yiddish Committee of the Toronto UJA Federation has been collaborating with the California Institute of Yiddish Language and Culture, or Culture and Language in Los Angeles, to present a variety of webinars that reflect our shared interest in preserving and promoting Yiddish language and culture. Many of them were suggested by Miri Coral. They included Professor Yoshiji Hirose of Okayama, Japan, with his book, Glimpses of a Unique Jewish Culture from a Japanese Perspective, an interview with Goldie Morgenthaler about her mother, Baba Rosenfarb, animation sings new life into Yiddish songs with Jane Pepler, a very popular recording on our YouTube channel. How to Tell Your Fortune in Yiddish with Sam Glauber. Yiskerbücher, The Untapped Treasure of the Last Collected Memories of a Vanished Culture. All of these were suggested by Miri. The Dybbuk remix, Dancing Between Worlds, with the dancer, choreographer, and filmmaker Karen Goodman. The Feeling of Words in the Warsaw Ghetto with Hannah Polin-Galai. Building and Consoling a Nation, The Yiddish Historians Before and After the Holocaust with Mark L. Smith. 7 Decades Strong, parts 1 and 2, which was an amazing shmuas with Mike Burston. And Hannah Cohen and the Infinite Prowess of Yiddish Music with Diana Matut. And most recently, Rachel Auerbach's Lifelong Struggle for Yiddish Culture with Professor Samuel Castle. As you can see, these programs have all been very, very diverse and of great interest. Now, let me see where I want to go next with this. I'm going to start my slideshow. And, whoops, okay. So, and I haven't done this in a while, so you're going to have to bear with me. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about On the Waves of Destiny, the remarkable life and writings of Lili Berger. When Miri Corral asked me to do a program on the remarkable life and writings of Lili Berger, my first reaction was to say no. To begin with, I had already participated in two very successful in-person events in Toronto, celebrating the publication of our recent book in March 2025, and the title On the Waves of Destiny, the Selected Writings of Lili Berger. It's a collection of translations of short stories and essays by Lili Berger. However, I've learned over the years to trust Miri's judgment when it comes to programming, so I agreed, and the following is my presentation on the remarkable life and writing of Lili Berger. Lili Berger, who was she and why was she so important? She was a prolific writer, a journalist, a novelist, an essayist, a writer of short stories, a literary critic, and much more. Born in 1916 in the town of Malkin or Malkina, Poland, she lived through the most transformative and traumatic events of the 20th century. World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Civil War in Russia, the prelude to World War II and its aftermath, the rise and fall of communism in Eastern Europe, and the creation of the State of Israel. And she made it her mission to chronicle them all. She was educated at a Jewish high school for girls in Warsaw, studied pedagogy in Belgium, and taught in Yiddish schools in Paris until the outbreak of World War II. During the Nazi occupation, she joined the communist resistance, where she met her husband, Louis Granovsky, its leader. At great personal risk, she played a role in rescuing Jewish children from deportation. This portrait of Lili Berger, as you can see in my notes there, was by Ben Sion Rabinovich, who was known as Ben. My interest in Lili Berger dates back to when I first read her story in the book Found Treasures, entitled St. Catherine's Day. When I was asked to contribute some entries on Yiddish women writers to what is now called the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, Lili Berger was one of the women I chose to write about. In order to do this entry, I felt I had to read as much as possible of her work, and I couldn't believe how much she had written. I'm going to read a little excerpt from that entry. The subject of Berger's numerous articles and essays were often writers and artists. She considered it her duty to write about the creative and courageous people whom she had known personally, who had experienced the horrors of the Holocaust or the Soviet Gulag, and faced further ordeals in post-war communist Poland. These pen portraits are painted in broad strokes, interwoven with personal recollections, information, and ideas. Her work is full of valuable historical detail, but on the other hand, Berger often leaves her reader with unanswered questions to reflect upon and ponder. One certainty, however, emerges from her work written after her disillusionment with the New Poland: the centrality of Israel in Jewish life. Similarly, her fiction deals with various aspects of the Polish-Jewish experience in the 20th century. Her stories are peopled by characters scarred by the Holocaust. A 15-year-old Polish Catholic girl who discovers that she was born a Jew. An elderly Jew married to a French woman who had risked her life to save his, who encounters difficulties when he wants to bury her in a Jewish cemetery. A young man who rejects his parents for hiding their Jewish identity in post-war Poland. My parents brought back this little book about Ben from Paris in the 1970s. They had met him and he had inscribed this booklet. Had they met Lili Berger during that visit? It's entirely possible because my parents had met other Yiddish-speaking Jews in Paris and had a few of her books in the house. This is an inscription by Ben to my parents in that book. Now, I'm going to talk about Louis Gronowski, who was the husband of Lili Berger. The Celts pogrom of 1946 had deterred many Jews from returning to Poland. But despite warnings, including from members of his own family, about anti-Semitism and pogroms, in 1949, Gronowski decided that he wanted to leave France to go back to Warsaw to help build the new Poland, as they called it. He was immediately made a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Poland, in charge of the propagandists section, and they were given a spacious apartment. While her husband considered himself a Pole and would have preferred to forget his Jewish origins entirely, Berger strongly identified as a Yiddish-speaking Jew and participated in the small Yiddish-speaking community in Warsaw. An active member of the Communist Party of Poland and on the editorial board of the government-sponsored literary monthly Jiddische Schriften, she was a strong advocate for the rebuilding of Jewish life in Poland, exhorting Polish Jews who had survived the war in the Soviet Union, which was a substantial part of their readership, not to abandon the graves of their ancestors. Berger published a few books during her stay in Poland and after her return to Poland. This book of essays and sketches by Lili Berger was published in Warsaw in 1965. This is the cover of an epic novel that follows the lives of a group of characters after the war, including Jewish children hidden by Poles, the Poles who hid them, and a woman who had survived the terrible medical experiments carried out by the Nazis. It was published in Warsaw, as you can see, in 1967. Berger also published this small book about the Polish Jewish artist Mushka, Adam Mushka. This book had belonged to my parents, and one of them had inserted a newspaper clipping about the exhibition inside the book. The headline for the article from the Yiddish Vorwärts of January 23rd, 1971, reporting the exhibition for Mushka that took place in Paris at that time. The headline reads, a Jewish Polish artist, the sensation of Paris. Living in Poland, Lili Berger began to hear and collect stories from the people around her. Stories of hidden children, of the Poles who hid them, of children adopted by Poles, eventually discovering their Jewish identity. She listened carefully to all the stories around her and retold them. For example, the children hidden in the story St. Catherine's Day is included in the anthology Found Treasures. So what's really amazing and remarkable about Lili Berger is that she herself was not in Poland during the Holocaust. She didn't live through all the things that she wrote about, but she made it her mission to find out about them and write about them. She wrote about the the difficulties faced during World War II who were hidden by Poles. And one example is a story entitled Jewish Children on the Aryan Side, which appeared in the Exile book of Yiddish women writers. And it reveals the heroism of Poles who hid Jewish children and their motivations for doing so. It also explains the hardships faced by the children themselves. In this story, Berger writes about the case of a little boy who was taken in by a Catholic woman who pretended that he was her child. She had been given identity papers by the Polish resistance, but it was the papers that she had was for a girl, and she had a boy with her. And and the boy had to pretend actually that he was mute because it was absolutely impossible for him to speak Polish using the feminine forms. He was fluent in Polish, but he was a Jewish child. He had to be hidden, but he couldn't use the feminine forms. His head just didn't work that way. And it made me think about how unique the English language is with regard to gender neutrality. That boy would have had the same difficulties in speaking Russian, French, Spanish, German, Hebrew, even Yiddish. His only option was not to speak at all. After close to 20 years, Berger and her husband fled Poland during the virulent anti-Jewish campaign of 1968 and found their way back to France. Upon her return to Paris, she could finally write freely, and she wrote non-stop. 2 years after arriving in France, she already published a collection of short stories called Abgerissene Zweigen. The Yiddish title literally means severed branches, but on the French title page, as you can see here, she used the words les épaves, a word meaning wreckage, specifically used for shipwrecks. In her foreword to the book, she stated that her goal was to convey to her readers the emotional state of the small group of Holocaust survivors who had remained in Poland after World War II, their fear, anxiety, suspicion, and mistrust. None of the stories in this volume, she emphasized in her introduction, were made up. They were constantly circulating in the background, hovering around us. This is the first book that she published in France, and it was illustrated by the artist Ben, who I've shown you already. None of the other books that she published, it was followed by 6 more collections of essays and short stories, but none of them had illustrations like this first one. It's a beautiful book. Lili Berger was finally able to realize her mission to memorialize the thousands of Jewish intellectuals, artists, musicians, educators, and others murdered in the Holocaust, among them those whom she had known personally. I contributed 4 translations to our book On the Waves of Destiny. All 4 are essays I chose to translate because they contained interesting biographical information about Berger herself. She never wrote her own memoirs, but the details about her life can be gleaned by what she wrote in essays about others. The essays I translated also reflect her deeply felt obligation to memorialize the victims of the Holocaust, and also her desire to write about women. They revealed her strong interest in the creative process, in art and in art in particular, and the question of Jewish identity. Is there such a thing as Jewish art, as a Jewish artist, as well as her belief in the centrality of Israel in Jewish life? In the essay that I translated about Bruno Schulz, Berger took the opportunity. Well, I'm just going to go back for a second. I just wanted to say that the essay about Ringelblum sheds light on Lili Berger's time as a student in the Polish Jewish gymnasium she attended in Warsaw, where he was a popular teacher, but also her life as a young Yiddish teacher in Warsaw in Paris just prior to World War II. In the essay I translated about Bruno Schulz, Berger took the opportunity to draw attention to the plight of Jewish authors who wrote in Polish, and I quote, "Among the Jewish authors felled by Hitler's sword were those who wrote in Polish. Their fate under the Nazi regime was tragically complicated and particularly heartrending. Completely unknown to the vast majority of Jews, they found themselves doubly confined and isolated in the ghetto due to their lack of communication with those who shared their fate. After their death, the little that remained of their literary legacy suffered an equally tragic fate. They were all killed as Jews, but have remained unknown in the Jewish world, except perhaps for Bruno Schulz, because people still do know something about him. But there were others, like the sensitive poet Enrika Lazovertovna, who earned a reputation in the Warsaw Ghetto for her moving poem, The Little Smuggler, in which she described the tragedy and heroism of Jewish children. How many of us know about this poet and her literary impact? There were other poets and other prose writers, such as Irena Geisler and Gustava Jurecka. In one of the essays I translated, Berger poignantly reveals the indignities that she endured as a Jewish writer during her final years in communist Poland. This essay is about the Yiddish writer Naftali Herz Cohen on the right. The essay is about Naftali Herz Cohen, who, after years spent in Soviet labor camps, he had gone to Russia believing that in the ideals of the USSR, and he was arrested and sent to labor camps. He returned to Poland in 1959. Less than 1 year later, Cohn was arrested. Berger describes her efforts to intervene on his behalf, but in that essay, the same essay, she described her own mistreatment 8 years later, when the time finally had come for her and her husband to leave Poland. I'm going to read just a few sentences from my translation of Berger's essay about the famous sculptor Hanna Orlov. In characteristic fashion, Berger uses the opportunity not just to recall Hanna Orlov, but other Jewish artists as well. And I quote, "People had told me a great deal about Hanna Orlov. The first was my friend Hanna Kowalska. A few days before her arrest, we took a long walk through the streets of the Jewish quarter of Paris after a meeting connected with our work in the French resistance. She had wanted to tell me about the various Jewish artists about whom she had written and promised to take me to meet them. Hanna Kowalska could not keep her promise to introduce me to Hanna Orlov. Her life ended in the ovens of Auschwitz. And just to update Hannah Orlov's story, and to bring it up to date, on October the 7th, 2024, the website of the Museum of Jewish Art and Culture in Paris, which has some of the work of Hannah Orlov, on their website had posted that 3 members of Hannah Orlov's family living on kibbutz Be'eri in southern Israel, or it was at the town of Be'eri in southern Israel, were killed by Hamas terrorists. 7 other members of the family, including 3 children, were taken hostage. I haven't been able to follow up on this, but I assume that, well, they were either released or they weren't. But if you can find out anything about this and you want to, I would be very happy to hear about it. Now, Yiddish, and that is the Polish spelling for the word Yiddish in Yiddish, which means something new or surprising. It is a Jewish Polish magazine, and I wrote here that it appears 4 times a year, and it receives funding from nonprofit organizations in Poland, and it's delivered free of charge to members of the Jewish community. Now, this edition, Winter 2023, featured stories by Lili Berger. Berger's son, Michel, who was born in Paris in 1945, before his parents returned to Poland, was interviewed from his home in Paris, where he now lives. He had returned at the age of 14. And you can see that it also comes out in the English language. I think that the interest in Lili Berger in Poland now can be attributed to our book On the Waves of Destiny. Because when our book came out, we started getting inquiries from Polish translators about the work of Lili Berger and where to find it. Polish translators of Yiddish. Berger's son, Michel Gronowski, was approached by a Polish translator, as I said, even before the book that it was published. In this slide, I think it's in the next slide. No, I guess it is in this slide. If you don't know Polish, there's an English edition of this magazine, and you can use Google Translate to translate some of the articles in it into English. So I'm going to stop my slide presentation here. And I just wanted to say that in conclusion, I think we have much to learn from the Yiddish writing of Lili Berger, and that only translation will allow it to stand as she had intended, as a monument to the Jewish writers and artists murdered in the Holocaust, and that only translation will rescue their work for future generations. I hope that our collection of these stories on the waves of destiny will stimulate interest not only in Lili Berger, but the many, many others whose names appear in its pages. Now, I'm finished with the formal presentation for today, but I would be happy to read to you some from the stories or essays on the waves of destiny that I translated, because I think that you would find it interesting. So I think I will read some of what I wrote about the visit to Hannah Orlov because it's so full of information. And it starts like this. If the Jewish public knows little about Jewish visual artists, it knows even less about Jewish women artists. Yet there are many talented female painters, graphic artists, and sculptors, among them artists in whom other nations would take great pride. If an epic novel were to be written about the life of a Jewish artist, how much more sweeping and dramatic would be a novel about a Jewish woman artist? Just imagine a book about the tragic life of the painter Esther Karp, whose days ended prematurely in a psychiatric institution, or Hanna Kowalska, who managed to continue drawing in a concentration camp. And I'm not even starting at the very top of the list. The difficult lives of many visual artists have inspired great writers in the non-Jewish world. In every other national literature, artists are the subject of a large number of books, not only monographs and essays, but also novels and literary biographies. I'm referring here not only to novels about famous artists such as Rembrandt, Goya, Toulouse-Lautrec, or Van Gogh, but also to books about lesser-known artists and contemporary artists. Yet we had Maurice Gottlieb, Noam Aronson, Chaim Soutine, and Moshe Kisling, to name but a few. What does the Jewish public know about these great Jewish masters or about such tragic figures as the women I already mentioned? How many Jewish writers chose to address this subject? Even the Yiddish press devotes little time to Jewish artists and still less to Jewish women artists. The truth is that Hannah Orlov is an exception. Although she confided to me that she has experienced her share of adversity, Hannah Orlov had the good fortune to have two homelands in which her art resonated profoundly. She is known in both France, especially in the arts community, and Israel, and in other countries as well. Her work has been prominently displayed in museums and major exhibitions. One of her exhibitions in Israel is entitled 50 Years of Sculpture, and it traveled throughout the country, or it was entitled. Hannah Orlov has had a long artistic career. She experienced the divine creative spark early in life. At the same time came years of wandering. At the age of 15, she emigrated with her parents from a Ukrainian town to Palestine. There, in the land of her ancestors, she took her first artistic step. Her great desire to study and perfect her art brought her to Paris at the age of 23. And although she settled in the city of art, she remained connected by every fiber of her being to the land of Israel and later the state of Israel. So, and then she goes on to talk about whether there is such a thing as a Jewish artist. And she said, Hannah Orlov said, yes, I can tell. And and she goes on to describe the method of working of artists like Chagall as compared to other artists. And what is amazing about Lili Berger is the breadth of her knowledge, her familiarity with world literature, her familiarity with great art and artists. She must have read voraciously, and she was able to retain so much. So, in short, she really was a very remarkable woman. And I think I'm going to allow time now for any questions from the audience. And we'll see. I haven't even checked to see. I see that there are a few, and but no, those are from the
Yeah, the chat.
from when they,
So,
do you see anything, Miri?
not yet. So I did neglect to mention to everyone at the beginning that if you have any questions, to please write them in the Q&A. We will be able to see the Q&A and be able to respond to you at the end of Vivian's talk. So first of all, Vivian, thank you so very much. Herzlichen Dank. That was a fascinating glimpse into a really unusual woman. And I guess maybe I can, while you are all thinking about what you might ask of Vivian, maybe I can start out with a few questions of my own that came up. So obviously she's focusing on women to some degree and women artists who've been neglected. And I'm just wondering if you observed in any of the biographical material or autobiographical material whether she herself had a struggle, let's say, to be published, to be acknowledged in the Yiddish literary world for her work. I mean, when I came across her name quite a bit when we were digitizing the journal that was published here in Los Angeles called Cheshbon. There were 150 issues of that journal, of that literary journal, which not only highlighted writers from the Los Angeles area, but also drew articles and literary works from all over the Yiddish world. And her name kept popping up, Lili Berger, Lili Berger, in so many of the issues when I was translating the tables of contents. And it was notable because she was really like the only woman. Everyone else who was contributing was a man for the most part. I mean, very, very few women writers appear in those journals. So that's my
Well,
question to you.
okay. Well,
Was it a struggle for her?
that's an interesting question. First of all, she was an absolutely amazing woman. She was so prolific. She constantly wrote. Not only did she publish these large collections of essays and short stories, and there's about 8 of them, but she published journalistic articles in all kinds of publications. And she just kept on writing. I think it was the sheer volume of what she was able to produce. She was reviewed. Our book, the On the Waves of Destiny at the back has some of the reviews of her work by male critics. I didn't see any other critics, but she herself was a literary critic. She didn't, I don't recall her ever mentioning feeling in any way handicapped by the fact that she was a woman. She just sort of persevered and did what she wanted to do. I think she had a very strong personality, and she was just able to do what she wanted to do. The only place that she couldn't was in Poland, where there was strict censorship. But once she got to France, she just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. Now, as for getting published, like many men writers in those days, that was not easy. She had to, people, what they did and maybe still do about Yiddish publications is that they have to get subscribers to say, I will give you X amount and when the book is published, you'll send me a copy of your book. And she possibly did that because her books were published, and when I looked at the different publishers, often you just see the name of the printer. So they were sort of self-published, and she must have had some help to do that. But one thing I didn't mention, and I should have mentioned a little bit more about this, her husband, she was married to Michel Granovsky. And he was an ardent communist, as she was at that time. But she became disillusioned with Poland.
But wasn't Michelle her son? Wasn't Michelle?
Sorry, Louis was her husband. She became disillusioned much before him. because there were a lot of things that he chose not to see that were wrong with what the communist regime was doing in Poland, the collectivization of land of the peasants and putting them into poverty and all kinds of things that were not done, and the people who were persecuted by the party under when he was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So so but she went on publishing and in the communist publication. So in a way, she was an apologist for the regime, but but in terms of her role as a woman, I have not come across her mentioning that in any way, even when she was talking about other women writers and artists, because the women that she chose were strong characters like Hannah Orlov or or the others that she wrote about. But it's a good question. I just wanted to say that I had intended to say more about Louis Granovsky because he published his own book when he got to France. And that book was called Le Dernier Grand Soir, like the last hurrah or the last celebration. And it has never been translated. There are copyright issues associated with that book because it is a fascinating book. And he wrote with great contrition about his role as a communist in Poland and what he had done. And unlike other former communists that wrote memoirs, he didn't try to excuse it in any way. And that book was recently written about in the French press. It had been rediscovered. And there are articles, if you search him now, you will find articles about him and about other members of the resistance. And because he was a hero during the war in France. And that's why it was so difficult for him to remain in France because he had no other occupation. He was just a resistance fighter. And that's why when he was, you know, invited to come back to Poland and was so warmly greeted, and they were given this wonderful apartment and treated so well, that he wanted to remain. But she became quickly disillusioned. But getting back to her role as a woman, I haven't seen that it stopped her in any way. And what's interesting is that they left their son came back with them to Poland. He was a little boy, and Granovsky had a nephew of some kind who was living in an orphanage, some younger relative. They took him in, and they had a little family with two children, and they settled in Warsaw. But the son was sent away at the age of 14 to go and study in Paris. And that's interesting too. So that whole issue of her, what she was like as a mother and so on, I think her son has been giving interviews to that magazine Yiddish in Polish about his relationship with his mother and what his mother was like, and especially what she was like at the end of her years when he got to know her. Uh, um, but in
So speaking of that question about the end of her years, actually we have a question from Goldie Morgenthaler, which is herself a wonderful translator of her mother's works, Chava Rosenfarb. Um, and she asks, can you talk a little bit about Berger's last years? Did she die in Paris? Was she productive until the end?
I think she was productive till very close to the end. And yes, she died in Paris. She died in Paris. But toward the end of her life, and her son has written about this in that Polish magazine, she started to lose her sight.
Mm.
And that was a big tragedy because it was very difficult for her to keep writing, and she was very frustrated in the very end, in her last few years. But otherwise, she had continued to publish, but not just the collection of books that we have. She was published in so many different publications all over the world, magazines, newspapers. She was extremely prolific.
So in other languages as well, I take it.
No,
Yes?
I know.
No? All of those were in Yiddish that she
All,
was publishing?
yeah, all were in Yiddish. They were all in Yiddish. I don't think that she wrote a few things in Polish, in Poland. One of them was, I think, the struggle of the Vietnamese people. The other was about the Rosenberg case in the United States. You could see
Mm.
they were political things that she was asked to write. And don't forget, there was a censorship too. So it was probably easier to publish in Yiddish in communist Poland too. But when she got to France, she was determined to write in her own language. And in that respect, I would say to Goldie that she resembled Chava Rosenfarb, that she kept writing in Yiddish. And and I don't know that she worried, well, it was an earlier time, that she worried as much about an audience as Chava had toward the end of her life. They were from a different time.
Do you have a sense that the French Jewish community kind of celebrated her in any way, was aware of her great contribution to Jewish literature? I mean, any sense of that?
That's a really good question because when I was in Paris when I first became interested in Lili Berger, and I was at the Medem Library, and they had some books, and people were bringing in books that they were giving away and so on. And I asked about Lili Berger, and I have to say, and I'm not going to name any names of who I met there, but what was not didn't take her very seriously, that she was always she took part in the cultural life of Paris, and they knew her in the Jewish community, but how she was considered, that's very hard to gauge from this distance of time. um,
Yeah.
One would think that, when she wrote about um, writers that other nations would be proud of. I think that she is one of those who probably didn't get enough recognition um, as a writer by the Jewish community. It's very hard to say, but she was definitely known. She was definitely known. And maybe now there will be more interest now that this book has come out in English, because once there's a book in English, it can then be translated into other languages too. But
Mhm.
but there's definitely been an interest in Poland in writing about her son, because he's given some interesting interviews in Polish to this Yiddish
Mhm.
section.
When, so Vivian, when did you first come across Lili Berger? And what was it that kind of initially drew you to her writings and to, really go to the trouble of unearthing her biography and her oeuvre? What was it? When did this first start happening for you?
Well, I I think I mentioned to you already that I had read the stories that she had written for the Found Treasures, and then again
So it was there.
that was the first time that I saw her. That was the first time that I saw her name. And the stories are different. A lot of the stories in those books have to do with the shtetl and looking back in time to the old country, and hers were a little bit different than that. And a lot of them have to do with the Holocaust, as I mentioned. So I found her an interesting writer. And I realized that she had written so much. And I actually, we had put out, this little group of translators here had already published the book Found Treasures, and then the Exile Book of Yiddish Women Writers. And I suggested to Frida that Lili Berger is so interesting and she was so prolific and there's so much content there. Why don't we just do a book devoted to only to Lili Berger? So she agreed. And Frida, as the very devout feminist that she was, put together a collective to do it as a collective. That wasn't my original idea. So it took a long time to get that book out because when you're working in groups and you're waiting for people to meet their deadlines and um, it took a long time, but finally it came out and Frida actually lived to see the final version of it, the printed version.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand that a number of the people involved in the collective are no longer
Well,
with us.
that's the
Yeah.
sad thing. We started out with a group of 7, and there are now 3 of us left, which is very sad. Of the people involved in the book on the Waves of Destiny. Yeah. So
I think we may have another question. Uh, oh, so Chaim Phillips asks, so how did the couple support themselves in Paris? I think in Poland we know he was an apparatchik, for the Communist Party, but how did they support themselves in Paris? And then the second question is, why the Book of Translations? Why is it called the Exile Book of Yiddish Writers?
okay, well, I'll start with that one because it's easy. It was published by a publisher here in Toronto called the Exile Press.
Ah,
You will find the Exile Book of other things. All their books start the Exile Book of. So they called it the Exile Book of Yiddish Women Writers, which in a way is fitting because these writers really were in exile.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so it was a fine title for our purposes, but it's a good question. And the second question, if you can just
It was about how the couple supported themselves
oh,
in Paris.
that's a good
Yeah.
question, and I really never asked much about it. I'm under the impression that there was some kind of a social um so that there were social services provided in Paris, I think. But and the question is, were they given citizenship? And I think that they were, that somehow I do think that they were able to obtain citizenship in Paris eventually. Um, but she wrote, and I don't think she earned much money from her writing, but her husband um, may have had a pension because of his role in the resistance. And I've never looked into that, but he is a known figure in the French resistance. He's known by his nom de guerre, you know,
Mm.
Bruno.
It,
And and as I say, there more and more has been written about him lately. So they managed to have an income.
so speaking of resistance, I know we're almost at the end of our hour, but um, you mentioned that Lili Berger was involved in the resistance with helping rescue Jewish children. Can you tell us just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, she started writing at that time. She was the editor of an underground newspaper, Yiddish newspaper, and they would distribute Yiddish leaflets. They had a clandestine printing press. They so she was very active in the resist in the it was the resistance were divided into these national groups. Like there were many people from Yugoslavia who had come to Paris to escape their countries, and they had their own groups, and they were part of the Jewish resistance. And so the language that they printed in was Yiddish, and they would hand out leaflets and so on. And they conducted acts of sabotage, and so that she's written a little bit about, and he's written about. And it's very frustrating that his book is only in French. But if you read French, I would highly, highly recommend his book. And at one point, I was thinking of translating it, but then I discovered that there are a lot of issues with who exactly owns the copyright to that book. So
if somebody wanted to purchase a copy of this book, On the Wings of Destiny, where would they find it? Is it on Amazon, or do they have to go to the UJA?
it's on Amazon. And they can
Great.
get it through the University of Toronto Press, but it's probably easier from the US just to get it on Amazon, or a lot of other booksellers have it. It's easy to obtain.
And if you wanted to read her writings in Yiddish, what volume would you recommend to start with?
Well, that's a very good question. I would say any of them, any of them. I don't have their names in front of me.
Mhm.
I should have. But if you look at her up in the Yiddish Book Center, they're all
Yeah,
if
they're
you
digitized.
Yiddish, I would
Yeah,
definitely say go there. If you really want it, see if you can get a copy through Henry Hollander or whoever else
yeah,
has copies of Yiddish
yeah.
things. But they're
Right. Who's just here in downtown LA. So yeah,
it's convenient. Right.
yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you,
Um,
everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vivian. I mean, we learn not only about Lili Berger, but also about other artists and writers that, would have vanished otherwise from our memories. And so thank you for that as well, for bringing them into our consciousness. It's so
Thank
important.
you for the opportunity, because I really do believe that she deserves to be known. And as I say, that we hope this book will make her better known, but also all the other people whom she mentions in the book. And she mentions a lot
Yes,
with
yes.
every artist or writer or musician that she mentions, she felt compelled to give you a whole list of others. So it's really a fantastic source.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Okay,
So,
thank
herzlichen Dank. Thank
you.
you all for listening and for your questions. Actually, is there one last question?
I just want
Um,
to give a herzlichen Dank to Sharon Power, who, as usual, has been
yes, yes, of
being
course. Behind the scenes, we
present.
couldn't do this without Sharon. Wonderful Sharon. Thank you so much for all the technical support, and of course the Committee for Yiddish. And hopefully, please stay tuned for more news about other upcoming events that we'll be doing soon.
Right.
So, herzlichen Dank. Stay warm, everyone who's in cold climate, and seid gesund, seid gesund. Herzlichen Dank.
Okay. Herzlichen Dank.